Hello, everyone. This is our fourth tax chat in the series Transforming Tax Administration. And this tax chat concludes our introductory section of the tax chats on transforming tax administration, where we've really looked at some of the foundational elements of tax administration. We started off with a conversation with Charles Rosati, who really oversaw the last major modernization effort of the IRS. And we moved on to the IRS budget. And then we went to IRS IT issues. And now we're sort of looking at really the third pillar, if you will, of tax administration, which is the IRS workforce. And we're going to talk about current challenges and then future challenges and good news, but also challenges, and how we get to a workforce of the future. And for that, I'm really honored today to be joined by Doreen Greenwald. She is the Vice President of the National Treasury Employees Union, and the National Vice President, and Lotta Bjorklund Larsen, who is a social anthropologist in Sweden. She's joining us from Stockholm, and she has done a lot of work with the Swedish tax agency and their culture and their approach. And I think that she has some really interesting perspectives. We were going to be joined by Bob Tobias, and unfortunately, Bob is actually having a root canal emergency done today. And we were joking, but that's not something you do to get out of something. So he really needed to have a root canal today. And our thoughts are really with him. So I'm going to start the conversation. And by the way, you can add things into the chat. We're looking forward to your comments and observations, and if you have questions, you can add them as you go along, and I'll try to address them and ask them of the panelists as we go. So I want to start with Doreen to just give everybody an introduction to herself, but also what the National Treasury Employees Union does and who they represent. So Doreen, you want to explain that to folks?
Sure. Thanks, Nina. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to attend this tax chat and talk a little bit about federal employees and especially IRS employees and their issues. For those who don't know, the National Treasury Employees Union is a federal union comprised of federal employees in 34 different federal agencies. Our largest agency is actually of IRS employees. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. Prior to my roles with the National Treasury Employees Union, I was a 35-year veteran of the Internal Revenue Service, retiring as a revenue officer there. So I have a long-time experience with the Internal Revenue Service, working various positions at the IRS and interacting with IRS federal employees.
Great, thank you for that. So Lotta, why don't you explain to everybody, well, first of all, your background and the work, what it means to be a social anthropologist, but then how you got started into the tax agency. And I also want to bring up this point here. This is a book that Lotta wrote called Shaping Taxpayers, and it's about her work with the Swedish tax agency. And the opening chapter of the book really talks about the role, in a way, not just the relationship between the tax agency and taxpayers, but also the role that employees play in shaping that relationship. So why don't you just talk about that? And really core to that was the sense of legitimacy, that the tax agency is behaving in a legitimate manner.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you for having me on this chat. And I hope I can provide some insight from this little country with a quite different political system and well, compared to the US, and yet we're always looking west, so to say, right? So I'm a social anthropologist. I came late in life into academia, and I did a dissertation on how you justify informal purchases of work, which sort of directed me to the Swedish tax administration, because I realized that they had in their hands a basically all-encompassing law. It said that everything having value ought to be subject for tax. And having, that together with their position as being one of the most revered public administrations in Sweden was very astonishing to me. And also on top of that, the old research said that the more taxes you pay, the more you cheat with taxes. And apparently Swedish people didn't do this. So I was very, very curious about why they had, or how they had obtained this data. So I spent 3 years as a social anthropologist doing ethnography at the headquarters following a risk assessment project, which led me throughout the organization, and I learned a lot of things. And one thing which was very, adamant was, and this is part of their own story, was how they had made the trajectory from being a very vigilant and very, aggressive, thank you, aggressive public authority towards the people they should serve or collect taxes from. So it was really, their view was really collect. And the way this really dawned on them was that, and I start my book with this anecdote, was that for those of you who are, a little bit more aged like I am, you remember the famous filmmaker Ingmar Bergman. And he was actually in the 1970s, he was rehearsing a piece of theater at the Swedish national scene. And all of a sudden, there comes some people, some tax officers and policemen, and take him away because they are going to ask him about his taxes. And, he couldn't believe his eyes. And even when they come out of this national scene, Dramaten, there's even a policeman standing at the back door. So this was for real, right? And he was questioned. And he was let off while he was questioned, they sort of go to his home and take all his binders and his accounting and so forth. And this really threw him in a state of, he got really, really depressed first, was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and then got angry and said, I don't mind paying taxes, but I mind being treated this way. And he migrated. And this was big news all over the world in the mid of the 1970s. Anyway, the Swedish tax administration, it dawned on them, we cannot treat taxpayers like this. We have to do something else. And they started a long trajectory of, being more helpful towards taxpayers, of servicing them, but also simplifying a very difficult, tax system, making it easy to submit your taxes and pay your taxes. So that's so that was the state when I came there in about 2012 and followed this risk assessment project. And the takeaway of this long winding story is that, becoming one of the most revered public authorities in Swedish society, and also being on the top list among Google, among Spotify, among IKEA for business or newly, people with business degrees as their desired employer. That, you do something like this, or it is a trajectory. So the takeaway is that it is a long turn, it's a long haul to obtain that type of position. But it also is, it's a long haul also for the people who work with this. They have to transform the way they see the taxpayers they serve, and how you communicate with them. And just sort of transforming the view how you see a taxpayer or a taxpayer who is doing wrong. Is it someone who is cheating, as we usually think it is, and sort of really is presupposing that, yes, we know why a person is not paying the tax, she or he is not paying the tax they owe. But it could also be that people are not literate, people do not understand the tax system crashes on them. It's, there are numerous ways. So what the Swedish tax administration worked with for a long time was that they said it's going to be as difficult as possible to make errors. So they worked with tax systems, they worked with the way they communicate with people. They work with the way how they see taxpayers, etc. And so that's where they were. And before this call, Nina and I chatted about this, and I checked the numbers, and well, they are not there anymore. The tax administration is not amongst the most revered public authorities anymore. It's not among the list of the most desired employees for newly graduates. So I sort of, we could speculate why this is, but I think it is because you view taxpayers more in a more vigilant way instead of giving them the benefit of doubt. I think it is perhaps, and now I'm speculating, but all the bad things that has happened with the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, all the big sort of avoidance that digitalization and other have given. Now I've spoken for a long time, I'm sorry about that, but just to give it a little bit of a background.
Well, before I turn over to Doreen, and I really, it's interesting to hear Doreen's thoughts about this, but I thought this background was really interesting. And I also wondered, when I was visiting the Swedish tax agency, one of the folks, Leonard, had drawn on the whiteboard a little stick drawing of a person with a harpoon and said that, the auditors viewed themselves as hunters. And I always wonder, where did that come from? And that goes to management and leadership. People don't normally make this stuff up on themselves. They're measured, they're told what to achieve. The tone is set office by office often, or goals set at the top of the organization that get translated down to the frontline employees, and they're just doing what they think they're being told to do, what they think is the right thing to do according to what the managers or the leaders are saying, or what they're measured on. And so I was wondering what you saw there in the agency that might have driven that behavior, but also drove the change. Lotta.
Yes, sorry. Well, so the people I worked with back then was that they had, it was very much talking about values within how we serve the community, and talking about, again, as I said, it should be difficult to make errors, and people should pay the right tax, not the maximum amount of tax. So it was never spoken about of getting as, of finding as many errors as possible, or getting collect as much tax as possible. And there's even an anecdote I can share about that I read in one of, it was Leonard Whitberg, the former strategist. He wrote a book about the tax administration or the agency. And this was, again, back in the 1970s. And there was one guy who had one tax officer that had seen that, oops, this taxpayer actually paid too much, so I need to, pay him back. And it was actually quite a big amount. So for years to come, this poor tax officer, he got become known as Minus Magnus. And, but it also says something about the culture. That was then. That would have not at all been possible when I was there, because there was very much focus on being, of listening into the taxpayer, listening to their concern, trying to understand why they made errors and why not.
So I wanted to start at this big picture kind of thing, and I want to turn to Doreen, but I just remember working cases with my case advocates, and they would say, we're getting these cases from revenue officers, like return of levy proceeds. After the revenue officer has released a levy because the taxpayer can't pay their basic living expenses. And then the revenue officer will close the case, and we'd be like, well, now you need to return some of the levy proceeds because the taxpayer had economic hardship. And the revenue officer would say to us, our managers don't want us to do that work, so you need to send me over, an operation assistance request so I can reopen this case and do that work. And you're sitting there thinking, oh, how wrong is that? You know, the incentives to not, you know, that what your focus is, you know, what you're getting from your managers is, you know, collect the revenue, but not correct, you know, not address the whole picture of the taxpayer. And, you know, in those experiences, the revenue officers were wanting to do what was right, but in their management situation, they weren't able to, you know, they were supposed to move on to another case of collecting revenue.
You want me to respond to that, Nina?
You can respond to anything.
Okay. Well, you know, I think what people need to understand is the Internal Revenue Service is in the name. And so the big part of what you're talking about is a balance to a voluntary compliance system. So service starts out with, as Lotta was talking about, the importance of having the tools and the resources available to make it easier for taxpayers to live up to their obligations. So at the IRS, there is a big part of the organization that is focused on delivering that service, to getting them the information they need to help navigate the tax code. And the tax code in the US is extremely complex. And for the most part, the IRS as a whole over the last 10 to 15 years really suffered from incredible budget cuts, which really drove down that service for taxpayers. Another part of that is the compliance function. Because it is a voluntary compliance, you need to do spot checks to make sure that people are doing and paying their fair amount. And it's not as the story, I think, Nina, you talked about having a hunter mentality or going up. That is not at all how IRS employees view this. I mean, basically, a good part of even in the enforcement position is an educational piece to help people understand their obligations, what's expected of them, and then working with them to determine the best way to resolve either collecting returns that haven't been filed yet or collecting taxes that are still due. And quite often, through that educational process and meeting those compliance challenges, many times people end up with a refund once they have that information. So it's not just about the collection of it, it's getting people on the right compliance path, so that going forward, they understand their obligations. And really, the IRS has suffered from these budget cuts. So over the years, a lot of the compliance aspects and ensuring that everybody is in compliance and fairly across the board has been weakened by those budget cuts. Because what happens then is when you don't have enough funding in the agencies, then only low income and middle income people, where primarily their income is from wages and are monitored through computer systems and things for matching based on what businesses and things report to the taxing agency, are monitored for compliance. The more complex cases that require people to actually sit down as accountants and auditors and evaluate that is missing when you don't have those kind of sources and employees hired to do that kind of work, because it takes many years for people to be trained and skilled in that application to actually audit taxes that have been filed and identify and work with people who have filed these complex taxes, including businesses.
Yeah, I think that's that emphasis on, you know, just the matching and, you know, going to what's easiest because you can do it. And I guess this goes to the ability to hire people who will bring the skills, you know, in to go after the, you know, in the context of the strategic operating plan, the above $400,000 in income, or the offshore, or the multinational or large corporations. And I know we've talked about this, that, you know, the challenge there for me, it's always been, well, you have people on board, and as you do more modernization, you know, you may not need so many people in the lower graded jobs, and some of them may retire, but what can you do for the folks in the lower graded jobs to train them into maybe more middle level jobs? And then are there people in the agency that you can train, get them back to school in accounting degrees and things like that to work on these new initiatives? And you mentioned when we were talking about this earlier about hiring people from outside, mid-level folks, and you know that they're coming in and they're faced with IT that is, you know, back in the 1960s and case management systems like they've never seen in their life. And then also they don't have the experience of actually auditing. Do you want to talk to that, some of those challenges about, you know, because that's something that the IRS is going to be facing going forward, but what's your view of the experience that it's had?
Well, as we all know, the Inflation Reduction Act really brought a positive investment into the Internal Revenue Service to help it rebuild and really focus on having the right resources to match the economy and the complexity of the tax code that exists today. So during these years of not having the funding necessary, it lost a lot of resources and wasn't able to hire the people it needed. And so we've already seen in the last year increases in hiring in areas of service. So we see levels of service already rebounding up, that they're able to address calls much quicker and answer questions. But the next step is then rebuilding the workforce to have the complex type folks in positions that can do auditing, that can do some of the other type of work, IT work and things of that nature. Rebuilding the HCO function that does hiring that took a large hit. I mean, years ago, I mean, for the IRS to just get by with some of these budget cuts, they cut like 85% of their training budget to manage from year to year. So training is a huge piece of ensuring that you have the best and brightest workforce and are able to not only service taxpayers, but also compete with other federal agencies and the private sector for people. You want to attract the best talent and retain that talent. And having, you know, there's a difference in filling a job and having somebody who is devoted to a career of service. And that is what federal employees are. They are committed to their mission. They're committed to ensuring that taxpayers receive the best service as well as education, that their rights are adhered to, that they're aware of their rights and walk through the process so that they understand that they're there servicing them and working as part of the federal government to help achieve all of these missions and goals for the IRS. And so what I'm seeing is a real struggle in this economy for the federal government and the IRS to attract new people into these jobs. One of those issues is making sure not only do you get them to apply, the application process is daunting. We have a new generation that is used to being able to push a couple buttons and they're in. It's still a very paper-driven process. Federal employees go through a background investigation. They go through an audit of their own taxes to make sure they have the integrity necessary to do the work of the Internal Revenue Service. And so those type of things need to be improved. Not only that, they need to be trained appropriately to feel confident in the job they are doing and be successful in that job, because that's what makes an employee feel worthwhile in their position, and it turns it from that job into a career. You also want to make sure as a federal agency, it costs a lot of money to train people and get them in those positions. You want to avoid attrition unnecessarily. You want people to advance in their careers and get benefits from that career so they continue and grow. I will tell you, working at the IRS for 35 years, it was an incredibly wonderful job as far as servicing taxpayers. It was very worthwhile a organization to work for, but it has changed over the years based on these budget cuts. And so it's going to take them some time to use these funds to help redevelop those career paths and build that training so that you have more and more people ready to take on these challenges.
I just know as the National Taxpayer Advocate, there were a few wonderful years where we were actually able to pull together all of my employees. We had one half of them coming into a week-long training symposium, and we had a second half come in the next week. And, that enabled us to design training so that we had a system where they had to take a certain number of courses in the job path, the job career, that they were in, the position they were in. But then there were electives that they could take in any position, so that if they wanted to go toward an analyst function and they were a case advocate, they could take some courses that were basic analyst courses that would prepare them, and they could put on their resume, when they were applying for future jobs, or they might be able to be considered for a detail into an analyst job, which would again prepare them for being able to apply for that. And then the other thing that was really beneficial was people from different offices were able to talk to one another and share experiences and learn from one another. And we also worked on having, our frontline employees teaching classes, so that, the managers were sitting in on these classes that the frontline employees were teaching. And all of that went away. And some of it was budget, and some of it was because another function of the IRS did something incredibly stupid with a Star Trek video and stuff like that. But, the point was that as you cut to save expenses and you're going on to only online training and canned training, where you're not having that give and take and you're not having that interaction, and you're also got the pressure of so much work that employees are like, don't take me, I can't spare 2 hours for a training. I will come back to a desk that's filed with stuff. They're not giving their whole attention to the training because they're thinking about what's back, on their desk at home. And that was, we really wrestled with that, trying to make sure, that everybody knew that they were out for this week, and scheduling callbacks so that they didn't get hit all at once with work when they came back, and having people cover the other offices. Only one half of the office left for 1 week of training. And it was a logistic nightmare, but it was really an effort. And the employees, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. They loved it. They kept asking me for years when we weren't able to do it. Where are we going next? What are we doing next? And we couldn't give them that. And it was great frustration to me, because whatever training we delivered, we knew it was really second best. And we've tried lots, but you didn't want to talk a little bit more about, the types of training and things like that?
Well, I think you raise a good point. Right now, the IRS is so depleted with personnel and resources. They don't have the people to give the training, to instruct, to coach, to mentor. They don't have enough, even as you say, like, half the office does this, and then so they can train. They literally don't have the time to take those courses, because the taxpayer and the service that they provide is number one priority. And so they aren't given opportunities to attend training or have those details until they backfill and are able to rebuild that organization to a level that it can both provide service and build in training necessary, because it's not a once and done aspect, right? I mean, obviously you go through initial training for the job, but to be successful, you must have ongoing training to keep up with the times, to keep up with the latest tax law changes, to make sure you are using your equipment appropriately and have technology and using it to make efficiencies in your job. And we could talk about technology too. The IRA funding, I mean, I'm very concerned for the IRS. This is a wonderful opportunity, but there has to be a plan to continuously fund the organization, because technology changes don't happen overnight. It's a step-by-step process, and that funding has to be in place going forward for years to actually get past this antiquated system that they use to develop new systems and make it more efficient. And in turn, then taxpayers will find it easier to communicate with the IRS and make it more easy for them to live up to their obligations. But they're also held back by the level of technology, not only that the IRS offers, but what's available to them. And so really the IRS has to have a system that fits all walks of life. People who have the technology access and people who don't have access to technology, because they have to service everybody.
Right. I think, you know, we had a, oh, go ahead, Lotta, go ahead.
I think it's fascinating for me to listen to all the challenges that the picture you paint here of an organization that needs to be rebuilt in all its aspects. It seems like it's the organization, it's what the education or continuous education of employers is, the technical infrastructure, how it treats taxpayers, or as a taxpayers. It seems also very, very important. But my question is, where do you start of all these different aspects? Because you have lined up a lot of them, or do they all have to come simultaneously?
I think, you know, my personal opinion is that they actually have to happen on parallel paths. I think, you know, we had a question in the chat about, you know, to what extent do you see replacing some of the antiquated, you know, legacy computer systems as necessary before some categories of staff expansion will be effective, and which priorities would you have? And I think, you know, from our conversation on IT, what people said was, you know, this goes to the parallel path thing. You need a parallel path where you're replacing the major legacy systems, but at the same time, you can pick some initiatives that are really going to, they're taxpayer facing or they're employee facing, you know. So for me, focusing on the enterprise case management system, for example, and being able for employees to have access, you know, that data is held in a way that employees can have access to things, so they're not on the phones saying to the taxpayer, I would like to assist you, but I can't see this information. I mean, what a horrible thing to have to do day in and day out and experience the frustration that taxpayers are feeling and then feel your own frustration. I mean, that change, that fix, that can happen even if you don't have master file replaced, you can do a better job on that, can relieve the employees and also relieve the taxpayers and reduce the number of calls coming in too, so that you're not so overwhelmed. But Doreen, what are your votes for
Well,
IT?
I do think you're correct in the approach that the IRS must take. It's going to have to do, you know, it's going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Obviously, you can't stop and focus on one thing and not others. And it starts with the commissioner. And I think the commissioner, at least from my perspective, has done since first being put in office, is that he's reached out to his key stakeholders. He needs to build a team and make sure they're all on the same page. He has reached out to the National Treasury Employees Union. He values the input from federal employees, which is a huge important step, because what you want to make sure is when you have limited resources, even though there's a lot of funds here, they have to be used wisely, they have to be used thoughtful, and he has a good understanding of that in managing that. But you want to make sure it's done efficiently, and that you have a plan in place that delivers what the employees know will work and help taxpayers, that you're not using funds, you know, inefficiently, that you want to make sure that you're focused on the things that will deliver the best resources up front, and then stage it accordingly. And that's why funding is so important, because what the IRS has had to do over the years when budgets were cut is either start a project and stop it, or take a cheaper version of the project, which never delivered what the business units understood they needed. It always fell short. And you really have to have an IT plan going forward with set funding to deliver a lot of these aspects. And I think eventually this will happen, but it will not happen overnight. And so each time you develop something, hiring needs to be a process that needs to be done in place, so you get people on board. You need to get them training. You need to get your IT things in place to start delivering on some of this, which will take away, as you build in efficiency, some of the paper aspects, and then you keep moving forward. So I don't think it's a one thing and done. It has to be multiple parallel paths in a plan designed by the commissioner and executed in a way that involves federal employees to make sure that the end result delivers what taxpayers need.
So I have some questions both about IT, about the hiring process and, the position descriptions and things. But I wanted to share, the experience that we had in TAS where we were trying to replace our case management system, which was archaic. And it was very urgent to me. The system was called TASIS because it was what my employees sat in front of day in and day out, and it made them nuts. I mean, it made me nuts to watch them have to struggle with it. And you could time how much of their day's work was spent just messing with the system. And, it would post stuff, unpost stuff, it was just unwieldy. And when we finally came up with what we thought the system needed to do, we created teams and we reached out to NTEU and we asked them for, and this is a regular practice, or it should be a regular practice in the IRS, where you reach out to the union and you say, we want bargaining unit representatives on these teams to bring the voice of the bargaining unit employees. And what was really interesting when we had, we broke up the different components of what a case management system should look like. And the first go round, everybody sort of came back with proposals that made the system faster, but it didn't revolutionize the system. And we had to go back to them and say, no, we really mean this. Like, if you were to build this from scratch, what would you want it to look like? And that was very telling to me, that they were like shortchanging themselves, because I think they felt like nobody would really mean to do this, really start from scratch. It was always just doing patchwork, if you will, and when we finally came back and said, no, this is not, it's not enough just to make it faster. We're talking about what would really change things for you. What do you really need? Then we got incredible proposals, but then our job was to sell it to IT. And often IT would not listen to us, where we were saying, this is what we need. And we have done this whole process, with frontline experts, bargaining unit experts, people telling us what we needed. And that was a real struggle. I wonder, Doreen, what your observations are on that.
Well, I think that you've pointed out one of the challenges with the current structure at the IRS. There needs to be, and I think in the reorganization eventually, at least the feedback we've sent from NTU over to the IRS, is a way that the different business operating divisions, such as IT, must work together to really address some of these issues. And so, what your example is what your unit needed to address things, and then IT went out and figured out what they could deliver. And those two didn't necessarily meet. Yeah. And so that's the challenge, is making sure, and that's where I think the commissioner is going to have a challenge, is to really figure out the right model that keeps the taxpayers in mind and allows everybody that works for the organization to work towards that common mission and in support of one another. And that's going to be a challenge. But again, you can have great ideas, but if you don't have the funding, and that's some of what you're saying is, employees first go at it, they gave you a Band-Aid. For 15 years, that's all they've been able to work with. So they couldn't see beyond that. Mm-hmm. Same with IT. I mean, everything is limited to whatever the budget is. And, that's the struggle, is making sure, the money that is spent in efforts to deliver the mission and the right plan, not just to deliver a system, but the correct system.
Yeah. That's actually really, yeah, Lotta, go ahead.
Can I ask both of you, actually? I mean, you mentioned, Doreen, what the taxpayers want. Where do you see, the taxpayers' views of their needs to address that? Because we speak very much about the internal organization and how to create a good environment to make people comply, right? But their views, obviously, it's happened so much on the technical side or digital side of things, so that, we can only imagine what do people actually need. How do you see them engaged in it, or obviously groups of taxpayers?
Well, I think there are a couple things that on many of the IT systems, there are contracts where you are, somebody was adding, yes, that is exactly what I was just thinking. It often seems the IRS fails to listen to what taxpayers, tax pros need, just like IT fails to listen to what staff needs. So I think there, the IRS does, nationwide surveys of taxpayers. The Taxpayer Advocate has certainly done. We did nationwide surveys.
Right.
I think that, there are advisory committees of tax professionals. There's a taxpayer advocacy panel that's made up of taxpayers. That's a federal advisory committee to advise the IRS. You have, there's a dialogue with the volunteer income tax assistants. There's supposed to be a dialogue with the tax professionals. There's something called National Public Liaison, where all the large tax professional groups come in and they are supposed to meet with the IRS. I will have to say that I was on a panel the other day where one of the members of one of the advisory committees of the what's called the IRSAC, the IRS Advisory Committee, which is made up of tax professionals, said that the IRS had not come and consulted with them on the strategic operating plan that they just published. And so, that was a real, surprise to me, because that's what their job is, to advise the IRS. And I think, there are, I think that there's a difference also between having more formalized communication with taxpayers and actually putting yourself out there. And that's something that I have seen not happen as much. When I was in private practice in the, before I became the National Taxpayer Advocate up to the 2000s, revenue officer group managers, revenue officers would come to stakeholder meetings and talk about what they're seeing. And Doreen, to your point about educating, like if an employment tax, they'd go to, the Kiwanis Club, they'd go to the local Chamber of Business Bureau, and talk to small businesses about what they were seeing as errors and mistakes, and what would happen, if they ignored those mistakes, then bad things would happen. And you don't see that kind of outreach now, partly because of the workload, partly because I just think that the IRS has sort of consolidated in at the leadership level and not expanded out and really done retail work. You know what I mean? Like really out in the field and talking to taxpayers and hearing what their issues are.
Well, I have to say, though, in defense of the IRS somewhat, I don't know that the public, we saw the last 2 years, the level of service was below 15%. That is not because nobody was at work. Everybody was at work working hard to deliver. There weren't enough people there to deliver. And so while I hear, yes, the IRS needs to understand, and I think Lotta, you bring up a good point about what does the taxpayer need. There's a broad spectrum of what taxpayers need, and that's a very important piece. And that's why I advocate strongly for federal employees who are actually doing the work with taxpayers face to face to give feedback about this, because they hear every day from taxpayers about what's working and what's not working. And too often people take a position and want to tell people what they need instead of listening to what they need. Yes. And there's a problem with that. Like I said, there's some people are there's a lot of private industry out there. You know what you can get with your bank. You can look at your account online. You can access things. You can make changes to accounts. That will work for some people. And I believe the IRS has plans to go in that direction. There's other people who don't have that kind of access or aren't comfortable with that access or need additional assistance. And so whatever the plan is going forward has to address all parties, whether you come from a household that doesn't even have a computer or access to the internet, or you are somebody who is very tech savvy and wants a simple, I can log in and do whatever I need to do type approach. As a service to the taxpayer, the IRS must be geared to address all of those folks equally. And so I think there's a lot of information out there that can come into play, but unless they are funded to do those things and have the resources and the staffing necessary, you can gather all the information you want. It's not going to go anywhere. And that's what's been the problem all along, is there has not been the staffing or the funding to deliver.
Because my point with my question is really, it's not an accusation of not having done it or so, is rather that if you can feel as an employee that you meet the, well, you know, the customer, the taxpayer, whatever, you can meet their needs. It's so much more fulfilling also as an employer, because, or employee, right? Because then you can really, how to say, you can really communicate together and work together of making taxpayer compliant. And so it also has, not only for the IRS employees, to my mind, but it's also for compliance writ large. As you say, Doreen, you have to create a lot of different systems, right? And also having, I read some of this in this SOP, this big memorandum done, and that they said transfer employees also to more face-to-face. And I think that is very much something people ask here, because they're so fed up with stupid chatbots and so on. And instead of actually someone who can listen to them and explain what is happening.
Yeah. I want to shift a minute to, actually, somebody had asked, well, what is the appropriate employee level for the IRS? And I think just like we have really diverse, taxpayer base, we need a really diverse workforce in terms of skills and everything like that. But I want to talk a minute. I was thinking about this, about position descriptions and the HR function, because you referenced, Doreen, earlier how, over the years, it's easy to cut the support functions. If you're trying to save your resources, to put whatever you can onto the taxpayer facing, employee base, whether it's on the compliance side, on the service side, that then it's easier to take these support functions and say, well, we're just not going to backfill if somebody from HR retires. And that leads to this incredibly long cycle of once you get a position announced, getting the package in, getting it into the hands of the people who have to look at it, and then being able to schedule interviews and all these things. But leaving that aside, it is so long to revise or create new position descriptions. And I was thinking about the employees of the future, where some of the tools that they're going to have, whether it's artificial intelligence, they have to have training to know, whether the machine is right or not. You always have to insert a human being into this process. And so that's a whole new set of skills. And so the existing PDs are like, so many of them were written in like 2000, and here we are maybe even 1990, and the job requirements have changed a lot. And I just was wondering what your thoughts are on that, and there's a whole process of negotiating the position descriptions, sharing them with NTEU and things like that, and how that changes the workforce requirements and their actual work requirements. But, just the process of even being able to develop a position description, to me, is an arduous process. And when you have an underfunded, understaffed HR function, it just takes even that much longer.
True. I mean, to me, the bigger issue with the position descriptions, a position description gives a generic kind of speak about what is entailed in the position you're doing. And it's used to determine a lot of different levels of complexity of the work, supervision of the work, and it's used to identify the grade level of the work and the scope of the work that the employee will be doing. For the most part, they're standard position descriptions, and they're written very broadly to give flexibility to the agency to use its workforce. As new technologies come into place and new processes come into place, there should always be an ongoing review of position descriptions to make sure they remain accurate to the work that's expected of the employees. They should also be reviewed to make sure the grade levels are appropriate for the work expected of the employees. More and more complex actions and more judgment is placed on employees, and that needs to be recognized and rewarded with the proper salary amount, making sure they're increased to match the expectations of the job. That also is important to ensure that you're retaining the right employees, because if other federal agencies are doing a better job at staying on top of their workforce and making sure they're properly paid, you will lose employees to going to other either private sector jobs or other federal jobs, because they're offered higher pay for the same work that may be being done at the IRS. And so I think you make a good point, Nina, that if you have job descriptions that were written in 2000, and if they are not accurate to what is being expected of employees, it is important that once your HCO function is up and running and staffed the way it should be, one of the goals of that function is to make sure that the jobs match what is expected of the employees and they are being paid at the right dollar amounts to ensure that they are rewarding employees for the work expected of them, and that they are in line with the rest of the federal government as well as the private sector to make sure that they are able to recruit and retain the right people.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point, not just about going out to private sector, but other government agencies. That's because you're a federal employee, you're not just an IRS employee. That's a really important point. We did have a comment in the chat. I'm wondering if you can speak to what difference has been since the infusion of dollars over last year. I know that system change is not measured in weeks and months, but I have read that there has been substantial progress in the last tax season in terms of answering phones and working through paper backlogs. Can you speak to this and how the current efforts to claw back funds impact this? Thank you.
So what I can tell you is we've already started to witness improvements in at least the forward function of during the filing season, people answering phone calls. As I said, they were at a level below 15% for the last two filing seasons. And last I heard, I think they were somewhere above 85% this year in answering calls relatively quickly. That is a huge progress. But understand that is only the answering of calls. They have taken a lot of resources and put them to the phones during the filing season to help make sure that they were getting to taxpayers' questions as quickly as possible. That doesn't reveal all of the back house type activity, the processing of returns, the paperwork, the adjustments, the amended returns, the enforcement side of the house of making sure that compliance is being addressed and that people are spot checked to make sure that there aren't any issues with maybe tax law changes or people not understanding the law, because that's a big part of enforcement is education and making sure that as they look through returns and if they identify trends, they can let the public know so they can make corrections to returns going forward. If there is a clawback of funds, if there are not continued budgets that support appropriate dollar amounts for this agency. And what I mean by appropriate, this agency is in a rebuilding mode. It is not in a growing mode, it's in a rebuilding mode. And the ultimate goal is to make sure that the IRS is at a level that supports the economy and the taxpayers and the tax law and code that they are designed and their mission is to uphold. So if that size of it is really based on the tax code itself and enforcing that. So you need to fund that every year. I get paying taxes is not popular anywhere in the world, but it's necessary to pay for the functions of a operating society. And so you have to invest in it and you have to make sure that it's operating appropriately. And so this funding is important. It is helping the agency rebuild. It's going to take time to rehire and get the level of employees up to where they can deliver on services, but that's an ongoing situation. And so it's not, okay, we spent it here in this year, therefore everything's fixed. It is not. It's an annual event that must occur.
Someone said IRS phone service has improved dramatically. I want to compliment the IRS callback function, which is amazing. Allow tax practitioners to be more productive while waiting on the return call. And again, that was simply a matter of funding and technology, you know, that the IRS could get that, but they, you know, they could only roll it out to a limited number of lines. And also think of the callback is a function of how many employees you have working the phones, because there's got to be, you can put callback on all the lines, but if you don't have an employee there to make the call back, it doesn't matter that you have the technology. So they could only roll it out to a few lines at a time because they only had enough employees to handle that component of the calls. I've always said that the phones are just a math equation, right? You have this many calls and these many, you know, you need these many employees. That's going to tell you how many calls you can answer. And we have way more calls. Now you can get those calls down through other approaches, but, you know, and making it simpler upfront or things like that. But to Doreen's point, you know, which I agree with 100%, is that there are always going to be people and always going to be issues that need to be resolved on the phone. So, you know, you're hearing.
And I would emphasize what Lotta said too, is again, what does the taxpaying public want?
Right.
And, you know, yes, some of those things, technology can answer some of this, but a lot of times tax questions are so specific to a family event or a business event, and it has a lot of variables, and chat bots and those things don't always have that capability. And so really listening to the American public about what their needs are and making sure that the technology that's put in place is a mix of technology, and having those phone assisters there to deliver is key to the success of the organization.
You know, in one of our later chats in June, talking about technology and data, there is a study, one of the authors or both of the authors of a study that looked at the use of not chatbots, but artificial intelligence systems, knowledge systems to give answers to people's questions. And they looked at it across the federal agencies, you know, to show that when you're giving legal answers, and one of the examples was in the immigration, you know, arena, people are asking a question and they get back an answer and it turns out to be wrong. And of course, the consequence of that wrong answer is that you may not be able to adjust your status. You may take actions that may lead to your having to leave the country later. And I thought that was it's a really interesting study to look at the limits of giving legal advice or consequential advice through these automated things. I want to make sure we get these questions. Someone said, is the IRS planning to measure how many issues are resolved with one call? For example, a quick survey, did this call resolve your issue? Because I've been getting through, yay, but lately the issues aren't getting resolved. I have to write. And I think that, I mean, you know, you all can weigh into this, but TASC did a study where we went out, a survey where we went out to taxpayers and said, where did you first, you know, where did you try to get your issue resolved? And did that channel, whether it was online or on phone or whatever, did that resolve your issue at first point of resolution? And we could tell where the taxpayer was going next. If they went to the web, then they went here and then they went there. And you know, we've always recommended that one of the major performance measures be first issue resolution. That's what they do in the private sector. That's one of their key measures. And what we found was that at least in the private sector, first issue resolution is the closest to giving a picture of the taxpayer's overall experience. And it's the key to them feeling good about whatever entity they're dealing with, so that they're not bounced around. And I think that also goes back to technology. Again, you call up on the phones and the employee, because of our technology, cannot see, you know, what's in your account because it's coming from a particular system. That's not for, you know, and then says, well, I'm going to have to write up a referral to you and they'll get back to you within 30 days. Right there, you've lost the taxpayer, and it's not the employee's fault. it's the technology. And that's why I think some of, looking at technology from both the employee and the taxpayer's point of view will show you where you need to put your prioritization on making changes, even as you're trying to replace the legacy systems.
Can I ask one thing?
Yeah.
I mean, there has been, throughout so much discussions about ChatGPT, right? Have you discussed it at all in terms of getting answers to tax questions at the IRS?
Well, there's a phone line for tax law questions. And there are also, Damian was asking, isn't there an issue with several areas of the tax code being out of scope for tax law assistance? And that is an area that, at least when I was the National Taxpayer Advocate, I followed that constantly.
No, my question is rather of this late invention of this chat GPT function, where you can basically ask any question, right? Or ask them to write an essay, or ask them, what should I tell my beloved one, and et cetera, right? So I'm just wondering if you had any discussions about using that in some aspects.
I don't know whether the IRS has. I do have friends who are testing Chat GPT with tax law questions and are getting, different results. And I think some of it is how you frame the question. And that's the challenge. And that's one of the things where what you want with a dialogue is a good assister will, just like a good low-income taxpayer clinic interview or a tax professional interview you have to have a dialogue to find out the full picture of the information so that you can give the correct advice. And some of the current systems out of this study that these folks were looking at found that, because of the way the question's answered, which is not by tax experts, it's by just, a person.
Yeah, of course.
What's the answer? I need help here. The canned answer is not pulling out the right information to be able to give a better answer. I think that technology is really promising, but again, you have to have, I believe you have to have that interview function on all but the simplest issues. I don't know where Doreen comes in on this or thoughts about this.
Well, I've not talked to the IRS about what specific technologies they may be looking. Again, I think the employees that we represent at NTEU, I mean, they deliver the on-phone and face-to-face activity with taxpayers. They're doing those interviews. They're having those questions. And the IRS does have a system where it kind of routes calls based on subject matter to make sure that the sisters they're getting are the most trained and have the most access to that information to answer those questions. Because not only do they want questions answered promptly, they also want to make sure the information they're giving out is accurate and guides the taxpayer appropriately. And so, while assisters may have answers for a lot more questions than what they're being tasked to answer, the IRS has made the decision to really focus those calls into different subject matters because they want to stay on point. And a lot of times if people call and they have, multiple questions that cross of a wide variety of subjects, they may ask them to put them in writing because they want to make sure not only is their questions being answered, but it's being answered by the people who have the knowledge to answer that question. You don't want somebody guessing or giving a half answer because that could lead to problems down the road. And obviously that's not something that anybody wants.
A few years ago, this was back in the late 90s, 2000s, actually. There was a system called ETLA, E-T-L-A, the Electronic Tax Law Assister. And that was available, and it did have canned responses. It was a very early really early artificial intelligence system. My former research director worked on designing it in IRS IT. And when it got to a point that, the taxpayer, but the taxpayer had the ability to go back and forth. Like there was a canned answer, and then the taxpayer could say, well, that doesn't really answer my question, or what if? And when it got to that point, the taxpayer, that question was sent to a live expert. And that live expert by email answered that question, but they also built the Q&A so that that response was added to the system. So it was an early feedback loop, to improve ETLA, so you could, accommodate more questions. So it really was a machine learning loop. It just had a human being in the process to make sure that the response was accurate, which I really liked. And the IRS discontinued it it was a senior leadership decision out of expense, and actually because they said that practitioners were using it a lot, with I guess the implication that we shouldn't be helping the practitioners get the right answer or something. They should be answering the questions themselves. And I thought, why would we not want to let the practitioners ask these questions? That's in our interest too, that they get the right answer. But anyway, it hit the cutting room floor as a cost savings initiative, which was very frustrating. But I thought it was a good system. And I think now with technology, you could really do that so much better by just building this knowledge base using the subject matter experts, which will then enhance, the pool of answers to questions as it goes on.
Yeah, the problem with a lot of those systems, though, is the canned answer or the pooled answer is still based on a very set of specifics.
Yep.
And so that's what's always so frustrating, is oftentimes the person who's either calling or visiting the IRS and has this scenario, it doesn't always fit necessarily. It's kind of like fitting a square peg in a round hole. Right. And that's the key, that having live assisters being able to ask those questions, ask follow-up questions, and really pull. It's key. I think in the chat, somebody talked about formulating the right question. Oftentimes when somebody calls, the question they think they have is not really the question they need to ask. And so It takes a back and forth a little bit to get to the heart of what's driving the initial question and leading them down the right path. And that's really, IRS assisters do a fabulous job in getting to that heart of that information and getting those answers out to people.
So what do you think is the critical thing that IRS should look at to improve the employee workforce, with the IRA funding? Do you have a sense of where you would, what's your highest priorities? And then I'm going to ask the same question for Lotta, based on her experience, just listening to this conversation and based on your experience with the Swedish tax agency.
Well, to me, there's two things the IRS has to do. Is they have to rebuild. And that to rebuild, that means hiring and retaining and having a transfer of skills with the people there. A functioning agency has to have a good mix of new hires, people middle in their career, and people working towards retirement. And that must constantly be a cycle that occurs. Because of all the budget cuts, they don't have that benefit right now. And so they have to rebuild to get to a point where they have that kind of mix, because you learn from each other. You learn through the years, you transfer those skills. And so the IRS really has to undergo a huge ability of not only attracting new hires, and that means offering competitive wages, using all the special pay rates and things available to be marketable in this tough job market. They have to work hard at training people and making them feel comfortable and experienced in the work, so they want to stay at the Internal Revenue Service and work towards benefiting and getting a career there. They have to tap into the skills of the educated people they already have there that have devoted their careers to their organization, to use them to bring on the next generations. And so that involves keeping them longer and making them want to stay and retaining them. So that's really the focus. And then also making sure that they are communicating the wonderful job that IRS does for the American people. There is too much false rhetoric out there. IRS employees are doing the jobs that they were hired to do to enforce the tax code. The tax code is not something the IRS creates. It's something that Congress does to address taxes in the country. They are your neighbors, your friends, your family. They're doing a job, and they are doing a fabulous job for the American people. And that's just not celebrated enough, in my opinion.
You know, thank you for that. And before I turn to Lotta, this just brought something else up we had chatted about before, which is really the geographic footprint of the IRS. And one aspect of that is, you know, when during the pandemic, you know, you were down from 10 service centers that processed mail and everything like that to, you know, 2 or 3. And one of those locations was Austin, and the IRS was in Ogden, and the IRS was trying to hire. Those are very high cost locations. And with the lower grades of the jobs, you know, it was just not competitive. They had Amazon in those communities, et cetera. And so I think the IRS really needs to rethink its strategy, one of where it's locating itself, you know, where it was shutting things down. But also to your point about IRS employees being your neighbors and everything, I really feel like it's very important to have employees throughout the United States. And with, you know, seeing over the years, you know, the shrinking of the real estate footprint, you know, for cost saving. But what it did was, like, whole states had maybe one office of IRS employees. So you didn't have an IRS employee in your community that you could look at when there was false rhetoric going out. Then you'd go, but this person serves on my PTA, and I know this is a decent person, you know. And I really have felt that, you know, and that also goes to having your pulse, your finger, not your pulse on the finger, your finger on the pulse of, you know, the tax paying community. You're out there in diverse communities, and you understand, you as an IRS employee understand and can advocate for the needs of that diverse community. You know, I feel that you know, that's something that we did in the Taxpayer Advocate Service. We actually said we're going to, you know, not backfill in some of our larger offices, so we can open up offices in smaller communities. Which also, by the way, gave opportunities for people to move into different jobs in some of those communities, higher graded jobs.
Yeah, and it really wasn't a real estate driven shrinkage. It was a fact that resources and staffing was not there because of the cuts. I don't think anybody would take the position that that work in every state in the United States needs federal employees to deliver services for the American people. Unfortunately, the budgets that were passed didn't provide the IRS the ability to do that. I think as the IRA funding is put to work, you're going to see more positions placed throughout the country. At least that's something I would like to see.
Yeah.
I think it's necessary. As far as the real estate footprint, I think they need to be wise about that. With all of the flexibilities available, and to be attracting new hires, a lot of the work, at least in as far as providing services to the American people, doesn't necessarily need a building always. So you have to, you know, keep in touch with what the current movement is to be attractive to the current workforce and still delivering what you need to deliver for the American people. And so what it looked like in the 1950s may look different now in 2023. And that's what you keep an eye on, right? So you spend your funds appropriately. And so I think in this reorganization, they will look to that.
So Lotta, where would you place priorities for the work?
I mean, I won't at all contradict what Doreen says, but I would rather take sort of slightly different view on things. And that's, as an anthropologist, I guess, talking about the culture within the IRS, right? But what I find is important is that the leadership can articulate values and beliefs and norms that all employees can adhere to, but they can also practice them so that they have the tools and the means of practicing the values that they are talking about. We're doing this for the American people. We are being reasonable, or we are doing, you know, treating taxpayers equitably, or, I mean, there's heaps of all these good values that should or makes for compliant taxpayers. Having said that, you also have to get the systems that can support the work doing this. So I found that is something that has to go through or cipher through the entire organization. And, I'm also a believer in that public authorities, they cannot just act on their own. They have to, in order to be seen as legitimate, they also have to sort of like tie into, and you said that, Doreen, these are your neighbors, your people you meet in everyday life. And that also means that the way they work, that cannot be just experimental. They have to tie into the values of the American people in this case, as the Swedish tax administration has done to the Swedish people. So working very much about values, but also making sure that these can be put in practice. And the second thing I think, which is, ties into that as well, is that have clear-cut success criteria for employees.
Mm-hmm.
So what are they going to deliver here? What is the success criteria? And that goes back to as well values and beliefs, right? It's not collecting the biggest amount of tax. It's not answering most calls. What is it? And yeah, I stop there.
Okay, well, any comments that you want to make? Any thoughts that you want to add, Doreen, to what Lotta said? Or
No, I think I agree with a lot of her comments. I think IRS employees understand their mission, and they are proud of what they do for the American people.
Mm-hmm.
Through tough times and good times, they have delivered time and time again. They care about the work they do. They care about the people they deliver it for. And they are the greatest asset of the Internal Revenue Service. And they just want to be valued in that way. And so, when you hear falsities out there, it hurts for people who are really believing they're doing a good service. And so I don't want to give too much credit to false narratives, but I do think that people will benefit from understanding that having a well-working IRS, and what I think the IRA funding is helping to do is rebuild the IRS so that it is functioning as it is intended to function, so that it can deliver for the American people. And when it is working well, it does a great deal of work for the American public. It helps deliver services well beyond the IRS by funding other agencies that they depend on. And so while nobody loves to pay taxes, it is necessary, and everybody should be paying their fair share. And that's what the mission of the IRS is, to make sure that it's easy for people to do that, they can answer those questions, and that everybody is held accountable to the same tax code that Congress passes.
I think in some ways, the biggest challenge for the IRS is actually beyond what the IRS can do. It's a cultural challenge in the United States that right now what's going on, that it's so easy to demonize the IRS, to not recognize that the code is written by Congress, to impute to everyone, just what your worst images, and not make the connection between revenue and what is being provided to the American people, what it funds. And I think that goes to Lotta's point about leadership, from the very top, and leadership from Congress, people changing the tone of how they're talking about it, because it breaks my heart to know that IRS employees don't want to tell the person they're sitting next to on an airplane that they work for the IRS for fear of maybe getting a tirade or something. You should be proud that you're working for the tax agency, which is why we kind of started with Lotta, talking about what was, that the Swedish tax agency, at least, several years ago, brought itself from this, hunter mentality to an agency that was the most respected of federal agencies, even in a country that has some of the highest taxes around. So maybe I'll just leave it there with that. And thank you both for being here for this conversation. I think people really found this, I hope people found this helpful and maybe gained a little bit more insight into the challenges that are facing the IRS and the IRS workforce. We will be uploading a video of this. We don't have a text for this, but we will be uploading this onto our YouTube channel. And because you're registrants, we'll be sending out a notice to you all when we upload the videos as well. So Doreen and Lotta, thank you both very much for having this conversation on, it just has been really helpful. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.